The night he arrived, Clara Wren was not asleep. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had not been sleeping well for weeks. The cottage held the particular quiet of a house that had once been full of voices and was no longer, and that kind of quiet had a weight to it that pressed down differently in the dark hours than it did in daylight. During the day, Clara could fill the silence with work. There was always work. The herb garden needed tending. The ledgers her father had left needed organizing. The widow at the end of the lane needed her tincture of valerian. During the day, a woman with capable hands and a willing spirit could outrun grief almost entirely. But at night, grief was faster than any of them. So Clara sat by the fire with a book open in her lap and a candle burning low, and she was reading about the migratory patterns of Arctic birds when the knock came at the door. It was not quite a knock. It was more the sound of something heavy leaning against wood, and then a slow, surrendering slide, and then nothing. She stood. She crossed the small room in 4 steps. She opened the door, and the storm blew in around the man who was folded half against the frame, half against the wet ground of the threshold, his dark coat black with rain, and something else, his breathing shallow and ragged in the way of a person who has been keeping themselves upright by will alone and has just run out of will. Clara Wren looked at him for one long, measuring second. She had her father's eyes for these moments. Not panic, not sentiment. Assessment. Then she knelt beside him and got to work. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The cottage Clara Wren lived in sat at the eastern edge of the village of Thornmere, in the county of Derbyshire, in a fold of land between the moor and the river, where the wind always found you a moment before you were ready for it. It was a small house, 3 rooms and a loft, with thick stone walls that her father had spent 30 years slowly improving, and a garden that had expanded and contracted over the years according to whoever was well enough to tend it. The village knew the cottage primarily as the physician's house, though the physician had been gone for 18 months now, carried off by the same fever he had spent 30 years treating in others. That was the particular cruelty of it, people said, that a man so skilled at curing should have been undone by something so ordinary. But Clara did not say that. Clara said her father had lived exactly the life he had chosen, and that a man who died in service to what he loved had not been cheated by death, only met by it. She was 26 years old. She had never married, not because no one had asked, but because the one man who had asked had done so with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had just realized that the physician's daughter came with a working knowledge of medicinal herbs, a manageable inheritance, and a temperament that would not make scenes. Clara had recognized the calculation behind the sentiment before he had finished his sentence, and she had thanked him with genuine warmth and declined with equal warmth. And he had married the butcher's daughter 6 months later, which everyone agreed was a better arrangement for everyone. Clara agreed with everyone. She found she usually did on that particular subject. What she wanted was not something she had found a name for yet. She knew what it was not. It was not comfort purchased at the cost of being truly seen. It was not the performance of affection in exchange for security. It was something else, something she suspected existed in the world because she had seen fragments of it in her parents, in the way her father had looked at her mother across rooms, in the way her mother had laughed at something her father said, as if the joke was still surprising even after 30 years. She had held those fragments carefully. She had not stopped looking for the thing they were fragments of. The village of Thornmere saw Clara Wren the way people generally see quiet women who are useful. They knew her name and her skills and her willingness, and they did not look much past these things because there was no particular reason to. She was plain, or so the common judgment ran, though plain was a word that people used when they meant something more precise and were not interested in the precision. She was slight. She had brown eyes of a color people rarely remarked on, because brown eyes required no remark unless they were doing something unusual, and Clara's eyes were, most of the time, occupied with the practical world, and therefore did not appear to be doing anything unusual at all. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's hands, wide-palmed and steady, and she moved through the world with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned that the most effective way to be of use is to arrive before the drama and leave before the gratitude grows uncomfortable. She had continued her father's work in the village to the extent that a woman without credentials could. She could not be the physician, but she could be the person who knew which root eased a fever and which preparation cleared a chest, and how to set a simple fracture, and how to sit with someone through the night without making the sitting feel like a vigil. She did these things without ceremony and without expectation of payment beyond what people could comfortably give, which was sometimes very little and sometimes nothing. And she kept her ledger of these transactions not in money, but in the knowledge that the work was real and that real work had its own accounting. Her father's books filled the 2 shelves in the parlor and 3 additional shelves he had built in the back room when the first 2 ran out of space. Clara had read most of them, not the medical texts only, but everything he had collected over 30 years of a mind that ranged widely and returned often. Natural philosophy, history, poetry, the serious kind that took work. 3 volumes of botanical illustration that she returned to regularly, because something about the precision of the drawings, the way the artist had rendered each leaf and stem with the reverence of someone who understood that a plant was a complete argument in itself, gave her a satisfaction she found difficult to explain. She read because it was the closest thing to conversation she had with her father now, picking up a book he had annotated and finding his penciled thoughts in the margins, arguing back at them sometimes, agreeing with them quietly others. It was a relationship of a kind, the only kind that did not require her to be smaller than she was. The man she pulled through the door of her cottage that night was large enough that the pulling required effort. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more, with the kind of face that the weather had worked on. Dark hair, cut shorter than fashion demanded, the shadow of several days of beard across a jaw that was clenched even in unconsciousness, as if some part of him was still refusing to entirely yield. His right side had taken the worst of whatever had happened. She could feel the damage through the coat, the way certain movements made him tighten even without waking, and when she finally managed to remove the coat and then the ruined shirt beneath it, she found the evidence. A deep gash along his ribs, 3 or 4 inches, not fresh but not properly tended. 2 days old, perhaps more. The edges were angry and beginning to turn in the way that men infection was already making its argument. The rest of him told a story of a fall from a horse, probably in the dark, onto ground that had been unkind about the impact. His shoulder, his hip, the heels of his hands, torn up from catching himself on stone. She noticed the shirt before she set it aside. Fine linen, the quality of it unmistakable even in the state it was in. She noticed the boots when she had worked them off his feet, made for a specific foot, shaped to him, the kind of workmanship that cost what a laboring family might spend in a month. She noticed the ring last. On his right hand, gold, pressed with a crest she could see clearly in the firelight. Old, the kind of ring that did not belong to a man who was merely comfortable. She looked at it for one moment, then she worked it carefully from his swollen finger and set it in the tin she kept on the shelf, where she also kept the smaller instrument her father had left her, the one she had not been able to give away. She put the lid on the tin, and she did not think about the ring again. There was too much else to think about. The fever broke on the 3rd day. She had not slept properly in those 3 days, catching an hour or 2 in the chair by the fire when his breathing steadied enough to allow it, and waking always when it changed. She had cleaned the wound twice, packed it with a poultice of comfrey and calendula that she prepared the way her father had taught her, methodical and clean and without flinching at what she found. She had spooned broth between his lips when he was feverish enough to swallow without knowing he was doing it. She had changed the linens. She had talked to him because her father had always said that the unconscious mind still listens, and if it is offered warmth it tends to hold on a little harder. And Clara had believed this not only because her father said it, but because it matched her own observation of the world, which was that people generally clung to whatever they could feel was present with them in the dark. She had told him about the garden, about the particular difficulty of growing lavender in Derbyshire when the soil was not cooperative, about the Arctic birds she had been reading about when he knocked, the way they navigated by stars and magnetic fields, and something else that the scientists had not yet found a name for, something internal and sure. She had read to him from her father's most annotated volume, A Natural History of the English Moors, and she had told him as she thought the author of it had been a man who was genuinely in love with mud, which was the highest form of scientific devotion, because it was impossible to love mud ironically. She did not know if any of this reached him. She offered it anyway. On the third night, around 2 in the morning, his breathing changed again. Not for the worse this time, for the better. The shallow, effortful quality went out of it. Something released in his face. She leaned forward from the chair, watchful. His eyes did not open, but his color had shifted, and when she pressed her hand to his forehead, the difference was unmistakable. The fever had passed. She sat back in the chair and felt, for the first time in 3 days, the specific exhaustion that only comes when the urgency is over and the body finally presents its bill. She did not move to the bed. She stayed in the chair, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and was asleep before the candle burned down another 1/4 inch. She woke to find him watching her. It was morning, the early kind, when the light was still deciding what color it intended to be. She came awake in the particular way she had learned to since her father's illness, immediately and fully, which meant she noticed him watching before she noticed anything else. He was propped, slightly on one elbow, which was costing him. She could see that from the set of his jaw, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not alarm, not confusion, something more considered than either of those things. She sat up. She said, "You should not be on your elbow." She said it as a fact rather than a command, the way she said most practical things. He lowered himself back flat without arguing, which surprised her. In her experience, men who had been told they should not do something generally required the telling at least twice. "How long?" he said. His voice was rougher than she expected, lower, the kind of voice that had been made by years and weather rather than birth. 3 days, she said. "You arrived in a storm. You had a wound that was not being managed. The fever has broken now." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling. She used the time to assess him as a physician's daughter would, color, eyes, the quality of his stillness. He was still very weak, but the underlying structure of him had returned. Whatever force it was that had been fighting its way back through the fever was back. "I don't know your name," he said. "Clara Wren." She stood and moved to the fire to begin the process of heating water. "And yours." Another pause. She was facing the fire, so she did not see whatever passed across his face during it. "James," he said. "James Ashford. Mr. Ashford." She did not turn around. "Do you think you can manage broth, or would you prefer to start with water only?" "Broth," he said, and the word had something careful in it, as if he were testing the weight of the ordinary exchange, finding it somehow different from what he had expected. He had not expected her. That was the first thing James Ashford, Duke of Ravensdale, understood clearly when consciousness returned to him properly on the 4th morning. He had expected, when he finally emerged from wherever the fever had sent him, the usual architecture of recovery, the particular overbrightness of sickroom, the practiced solicitude of servants, the managed warmth of people whose kindness was professional rather than personal, which was a kindness he was entirely accustomed to and had no complaint against, except that it was not the same as the other kind. He had grown up surrounded by the first kind and had almost forgotten the other kind existed. What he found instead was a cottage with books on every surface and a woman with brown eyes who told him he should not be on his elbow in exactly the tone one might use to advise a houseplant against overextending itself. Matter of fact, without a trace of performance, not nervous in his presence, not careful of him. He was, in the world he occupied, a man people were careful around. The title preceded him the way a tide preceded a shore, doing the work of rearranging things before he arrived, so that by the time he was actually present, the arrangement was already complete and bore no resemblance to its natural state. He was accustomed to walking into rooms in which the room had already performed a subtle, collective adjustment on his behalf, an adjustment of posture, of expression, of conversational temperature. He had stopped noticing it the way a man stops noticing the sound of traffic if he lives beside a busy road long enough. He had been the Duke of Ravensdale since he was 23, which was now 7 years. 7 years of managed rooms. He had nearly forgotten what an unmanaged one felt like. Clara Wren's cottage was magnificently unmanaged. Books occupied the spaces where objects might have been expected to sit. A sheaf of press plants was drying on the windowsill in a manner that was clearly more interested in the drying than in the appearance of the windowsill. A large orange cat he had not noticed before was asleep on the chair she had clearly been sleeping in, arranged with the boneless authority of a creature who considers all furniture to be its furniture and all territory to be its territory, a position that the cat had evidently held for some time and intended to continue holding. The fire was practical rather than decorative. Everything in the room was what it was, without apology or arrangement. James lay flat on the narrow bed and felt, beneath the pain of his ribs and his shoulder and his hip, something that took him a moment to identify, because it was so unfamiliar. Ease. Not comfort exactly. Ease. The ease of a place that was not performing for him. He lay still and let himself take in piece by piece. She had his ring. He had noticed the tin on the shelf the moment he was conscious enough to notice anything beyond the immediate geography of the room, and he had understood immediately what it contained and why. She had removed it, probably to prevent the swelling from making it impossible to remove later, and she had put it away not because she had looked at it and known what it meant, but because it was simply the sensible thing to do. He was almost certain she had not looked at it. There was nothing in her manner that suggested she knew. There was nothing in her manner, frankly, that suggested she was interested in anything about him beyond the practical question of whether his wound was healing properly, which she assessed each morning with the focused attention of a woman who was asking a question of the wound itself and expected the wound to give an honest answer. He found he did not want to correct the situation. This surprised him enough that he examined it carefully, the way he had been trained to examine any feeling that arrived with force. He was the product of an education that valued reason over impulse and had been raised by a father who considered unexamined emotion a form of intellectual laziness. He had, by and large, agreed with this. He had organized his own interior life along these lines for 30 years, with the notable exception of the period 3 years ago when he had been briefly and thoroughly disorganized by the woman he had agreed to marry, and had then been reorganized, more firmly than before, by the discovery of what that agreement had actually cost him. Not money, not position, something quieter and harder to replace. The part of him that had believed, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, that the world beyond his title was capable of seeing the man inside it. He had spent the 3 years since that discovery believing the world had been right all along, that there was no useful distinction between the Duke and the man, that the man was, in practical terms, simply what the Duke looked like from the inside. Clara Wren had, without knowing it, without intending it, and without any of the strategic interest that usually accompanied such moments, introduced a small but persistent doubt into this settled conviction. She asked him questions because she needed information, not because she was performing interest. She answered his questions without first calculating how the answer might land. When he said something she disagreed with, she said so, plainly and without the careful diplomatic softening that he usually received in lieu of actual disagreement. When she was tired, she looked tired. When she was concentrated on something, she was entirely concentrated on it and entirely unavailable for conversation, which she communicated not rudely, but simply by not answering, because she was thinking, and thinking required her full attention, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. On the 5th day, she found him sitting up against the wall with one of her father's books open in his lap. He had managed this while she was in the garden, and the achievement of it had apparently cost him enough that he was now reading with the focused determination of a man who has paid for something and intends to get his full value from it. She looked at the book. "You chose a botanical text," she said. "It was closest," he said, "though I would have chosen it anyway. I have the other edition. My father preferred the illustrations in the Forster, but I always thought this one was more honest about the difficulty of the subject." She sat down in the chair across from him, the one that was not occupied by the cat, and looked at him with the same measuring quality she usually reserved for the wound. "You know the Forster edition. My father was an enthusiast. Of botany. Of knowing things," James said. "Botany was one of several. He believed that a man who understood how something grew had a better chance of understanding how to keep it alive. He paused. He was a physician as well, in the sense that he had studied it, though he never practiced. He thought practice was the more important half. Clara's head tilted slightly to one side. Mine practiced and never stopped studying. He said they were the same motion in opposite directions and arrived at the same place eventually. Something in James's chest shifted, small and specific. He recognized the shape of it. It was a shift that happened when a sentence said something he had thought but not yet put into words, and the putting into words made it suddenly more real and more particular than it had been when it was simply a thing he knew. "What is the place they arrive at?" he said. "Respect," Clara said simply. "For how much there is that remains unknown." He looked at her. She had already moved on, was examining the wound through the fresh bandaging with the practiced competence that still surprised him each time. Not because it was unexpected in principle, but because the ease of it was something he had only ever seen in people who had done a thing so many times that it had become a kind of fluency. She was fluent in this. She was fluent in care. "This is much better," she said, more to the wound than to him. "You can try standing tomorrow, briefly, if you are careful." "You will supervise," he said. "I will supervise." She did not look up. "You are not the first man to believe he has recovered faster than he is. Ought I to be offended by the implication?" "The implication is observational rather than critical," she said, and he saw the corner of her mouth move in something that was not quite a smile, but was its neighboring country. He did not ask her to look up, but he watched her hands for a long moment, the steadiness of them, the sureness, and he thought about what it took to develop that sureness and what it meant about the nature of the person who had developed it. And he thought that he had been lying in this cottage for 5 days and that the world that was waiting for him outside it had not yet sent anyone looking for him, which meant he had perhaps a few more days before the search began in earnest. His secretary would manage the immediate obligations. His steward had standing instructions. His mother, who was formidable and well accustomed to his periodic disappearances when the weight of the title became too heavy to carry in company, would not immediately panic. He had a few more days. He was surprised by how much he wanted them. Clara Wren had learned, over 26 years of living inside her own skin, that hope was a thing you had to manage carefully, not suppress. Her father had not believed in suppression. He had believed in honesty, including honesty about what you wanted and how much you wanted it. And he had trusted Clara from a young age with the truth that wanting a thing did not mean you would get it, and that knowing you wanted it was still better than not knowing. Because a woman who knew her own desires was a woman who could make actual decisions rather than simply drifting toward whatever the current of circumstance chose to carry her to. Clara had taken this advice with both hands and had applied it to every subsequent decade of her life. She knew, by the 6th day, that something was happening in the space between herself and the man in her father's bed, and she was honest enough with herself to name it, at least in the privacy of her own thoughts. She was interested in him, not simply curious, not simply the interest a physician's daughter might take in a patient who was recovering well. Interested in him as a person, specifically in the particular mind that was assembled behind those careful, watchful eyes, in the way he listened when she spoke as if what she was saying mattered and he intended to think about it properly rather than simply waiting for his turn, in the way he did not perform anything, did not adjust his manner for her benefit, or try to be larger than he was or smaller than he was, but simply occupied his own space with a quietness that was not passivity, but was the quietness of someone who had learned that most of what the world called impression management was simply noise. She was interested in him. She noted this, filed it carefully in the drawer of honest acknowledgments, and then she set it firmly to one side, because he was a stranger with a fine linen shirt and a signet ring and a name that was not the name of any man she had ever heard of in Thornmere, which meant he was from somewhere else, which meant that when he was well enough to ride, he would ride back to wherever that somewhere else was, and she would be here in her cottage, with her books, and her garden, and the cat, and the work, which was a life she had chosen and valued, and did not need to apologize for or add to in order for it to be sufficient. She was experienced enough with her own heart to know that telling it a thing was true and convincing it of the same truth were often two different projects. On the 7th night, The rain came back. Not the storm that had brought him, but the steady, purposeful Derbyshire rain that fell as if it had been given a schedule and intended to keep it. Clara lit an extra candle because the cloud had swallowed the moon and the cottage had gone very dark. James was sitting up now, propped with cushions, considerably more himself than he had been even 2 days ago. The cat had transferred its allegiance to the foot of his bed in the discerning way of cats, which Clara chose to read as a clinical endorsement. She had been reading. He had been looking at the rain against the window and not saying much, which was one of the things she had come to notice about him, that his silences were not empty. They were occupied. He was turning something over in the silence the way you turn a stone over to see what is living under it. "Do you miss it?" he said. "The practice. What her father did?" Clara looked up from the page. She considered the question honestly, which took a moment. "I miss having its full scope," she said finally. "There are things I cannot do, not without the credentials I was not permitted to earn. There are people I must refer elsewhere when I would prefer to manage it myself, because the world has decided that the managing requires a document I do not hold." She paused. "But the work I can do, I do not miss because I'm doing it. I have not stopped." "The world's objection is to your sex," he said. Not a question, a statement made plainly, without the apologetic decoration that men sometimes added to such observations, as if the observation itself required softener. "The world objects to quite a lot on that basis," Clara said. "I find that managing the world's objections is considerably less interesting than simply doing the work. And when the work brings a stranger to your door in a storm." She looked at him across the room, across the candlelight, and said, "Then I manage the stranger as well." Something moved in his expression, complex and layered, the way expressions are in people who are feeling more than one thing at the same time and are honest enough not to flatten it into something simpler. He looked at her, and she looked back, and the rain ran down the window glass between them in silver lines, and the candle moved slightly in some draft from the old walls, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the moment was not uncomfortable. It was the other kind, the kind that means something is being understood without requiring words. "You are not what I expected," he said at last, quietly, more to himself than to her. Clara returned to her page. "I rarely am," she said, and she turned to the next one, and the fire crackled, and the cat shifted at his feet, and outside the rain settled in for the long business of the night. What she did not say, what she did not allow herself to say even in the privacy of her own thoughts until much later that night, lying in the loft with the rain on the roof above her, was that he was not what she had expected either. She had expected to find herself useful. She had not expected to find herself understood. She had not expected to sit in a candlelit room with a man who listened to her speak about the world's objections to her sex and did not add a softener, who looked at her the way people only looked at each other when they were not yet aware that they were looking. She had not expected any of that, but it was there. It was undeniably there, and she was too much her father's daughter to pretend to herself that it wasn't. By the 9th day, James Ashford was well enough to move around the cottage with a careful confidence that still honored the wound, but was no longer managed by it. He helped with the morning fire, which Clara allowed because refusing would have required a conversation about capability that she did not feel was worth having. He was not a man who sat when he could stand, or stood when he could be of use, and she understood this about him in the same wordless way she had come to understand several things about him over 9 days, in the specific manner that close proximity in a small space teaches you things about a person that formal acquaintance never could. He was private, not evasive. There was a difference, but private in the way of someone who has learned that the interior of a person is something they're entitled to share or not share on their own terms and their own timeline. He never offered personal information unprompted, but when she asked him something directly, he answered directly, which she respected. He had been somewhere before Thornmere. He was going somewhere after it. He did not say where on either count, and she did not ask, because she had understood for the first night that there were layers to the story of James Ashford that were not hers to have simply because she had pulled him out of a storm. He had a particular way of going still when something struck him as true, not a dramatic stillness, a small internal one, barely visible, just a slight settling of the shoulders, a fraction of pause before he replied. She had begun to notice when she said something that produced it. She noticed that she was noticing this, and she filed it in the same careful drawer, and she continued with her days. On the 10th morning, he said quietly, over the breakfast she had made more substantial than usual, because he was healing, and healing required fuel, "I think I will be fit to ride by the end of the week." Clara looked at her own cup of tea. She said, "Your shoulder will need another 10 days at least. You can ride against my advice, but you will do damage." "Then I will wait," he said, without any visible reluctance, and she did not look up to see whether that absence of reluctance was genuine or managed, because she was not sure she wanted to know. What she wanted, she thought, carefully and honestly, in the privacy of her own chest where no one could hear it, was precisely these 10 more days. And then whatever she would make of herself afterward. It was, she supposed, exactly the right amount to want and exactly the wrong amount to be given. The 10 days did not feel like 10 days. Clara had lived long enough to understand that time was not the fixed and democratic thing that clocks suggested. It moved differently according to what was happening inside it. The months after her father's death had stretched like pulled wool, each morning arriving with a weary slowness of something that knew it would not be welcome and came anyway. The years of her girlhood had compressed in memory into a handful of bright, specific images with all the ordinary days between them gone transparent. And these 10 days, these particular 10 days in the stone cottage at the edge of Thornmere with the rain coming and going and the fire burning and the books lying open on every available surface, these 10 days had the quality of something much longer and much shorter at once. She was aware of them passing the way you are aware of a held breath passing. The constant underlying knowledge that the release was coming, the constant underlying preference that it not come yet. He had found the botanical illustrations on the 8th day. She had left the volume on the table without particularly thinking about it, and had come in from the garden to find him seated at the table, his injured shoulder making the sitting still something it had not been a week ago, the large pages open in front of him, and his expression doing something she had not seen it do before. He was not reading. He was simply looking at the plates with the quality of attention that meant he was not seeing the images as information, but as themselves, as things made with care and intention, which was a different kind of seeing entirely. She sat down across from him and did not say anything. After a moment, he said, "My father would have spent a week with this volume alone." "My father did," Clara said. "He bought it in York when I was 11. He spent the journey home talking about the rendering of the root systems, and by the time we reached the village, I understood more about root systems than any 11-year-old in Derbyshire had probably ever been required to know." James turned a page with the care of a man who understands he is handling something worth handling carefully. "Were you interested, or were you simply obliging?" "Both," Clara said honestly. "When my father talked about things that mattered to him, the maturing was contagious. It did not require the subject to be inherently fascinating. The fascination was in watching someone be genuinely moved by an idea." She paused. "Do you have that? Someone whose enthusiasm was contagious?" He was quiet for a moment, the question settling into him the way his question settled, visibly, with a small adjustment in the shoulders. "My father," he said, "for the natural world, yes, and for a handful of other things." Another pause, longer. "He has been gone 6 months. I am sorry," Clara said, and she said it as she said everything, without ceremony and without decoration, because she had learned from 30 years of watching her father move through grief and loss that the stripped version of compassion was often more useful than the ornamental kind. "The timing of grief," James said, "does not cooperate with anything else a person must do." "No," Clara agreed. "It has terrible manners." He looked at her quickly, and then the corner of his mouth moved, the same movement she had been watching for days, the one that was almost a smile and was something more interesting than a smile because it cost him something to produce it, and he produced it anyway. "Terrible manners," he repeated. "Yes, that is precisely what it has." They sat with the botanical illustrations between them and the fire behind her, and the gray Derbyshire sky in the window beside him, and something that had been building in the cottage for 9 days settled another small degree, like a house finding its foundation after a long rain. It was on the 12th day that she found him in the early morning, standing at the window that faced east, watching the moor in the first light with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the watchful, considering look, not the careful, layered look, something more exposed than either of those things. He did not hear her come down from the loft, and she stood for a moment in the doorway and saw him as he was when he believed himself alone, which is always the most honest version of a person. He was carrying something. She could see it in the set of him the way she could see infection or healing in a wound, without the wound having to speak. Some weight that he managed so habitually in company that it had become invisible until you caught him without the management in place. Standing alone at her east window at first light, with the moor going from black to gray to the particular pale gold of an early morning in June, he was simply a man standing with something very heavy, very quietly, in the way that people do when they have been standing with it alone for a long time. She went to the fire without speaking and began the morning. He heard her and turned, and the management came back into his face, not entirely, not the way it had been at the beginning, but present. She kept her eyes on the fire. She gave him the time to put it back. After a few minutes, he said, "You were awake early." "The light," she said. "I always wake when it changes." He came and sat in the chair the cat had finally relinquished, and the cat moved to the windowsill with the air of one who has made a considered accommodation and expects it to be noted. Clara handed James a cup of tea, and he received it with both hands, and they sat in the morning as they had sat in many mornings now, and she thought, very carefully and very privately, that this was the thing she had not expected. Not the feeling, because she had felt things before, but the ease of the feeling, the way it did not require managing, the way it simply existed in the room with them like the fire and the cat and the stacked books and the gray light, an ordinary part of the landscape of these days. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. On the 13th day, the village came to her. This happened periodically, not often, and she had long since learned to manage the timing of it in the way that people who live between two worlds learn to manage such things. She usually saw her patients at the door or in their homes. But occasionally someone arrived without warning because the occasion required it, and this was one of those occasions. Old Mrs. Holt from the lane, her ankle turned badly on the path, her granddaughter supporting her with the particular worried energy of someone who loves a person and does not know what to do with a love in a crisis except to remain very close to them and make small, helpless sounds. Clara brought them in. She seated Mrs. Holt by the fire. She examined the ankle with the quick competence she always brought to these moments, and she was aware, at the edge of her awareness, of James watching from the back of the room, where he had withdrawn without needing to be asked to, with the unobtrusive quality of a man who had learned long ago how to occupy a space without commanding it. The ankle was not broken. It was a bad sprain, the kind that would keep Mrs. Holt off her feet for a week and would need binding and elevation and the particular willow bar preparation that Clara made in advance for exactly this kind of occasion. She explained this to Mrs. Holt and to the granddaughter with the calm, clear manner her father had modeled, the manner that said, "I understand what is happening here, and I know what to do about it. And that understanding is something I'm giving to you so that you may also understand and therefore be less afraid." Afterward, when Mrs. Holt and her granddaughter had gone, Clara went to the back of the room to retrieve the jar she had used and found James standing very still, looking at nothing particular, with an expression that was doing something she could not name. "You were going to ask me to leave," he said. "I was going to ask you to give us privacy," she said, "which you did without being asked." He turned to look at her directly. "You have a gift for it," he said quietly. "What you do, not only the skill of it, the quality you bring to it, the way you spoke to her." He paused. "People trust you immediately, not because you perform trustworthiness, but because you have not learned how to perform it and you have no interest in learning. The trust is simply what is there when all the performance is removed." Clara looked at him steadily. She thought of the window this morning, the weight she had seen in him when he believed himself unobserved. She thought about what it took to see that quality in another person, the quality of being genuinely present, and what it suggested about the person who could see it. Usually people who recognized the absence of performance were people who had been surrounded by performance long enough to know the difference. People who lived in rooms that adjusted for them. People who had almost forgotten what an unadjusted room felt like. "Where have you been?" she said quietly. That honesty is something worth remarking on. He was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at her the way she had caught him looking at the botanical illustrations, not for information, not with any agenda, simply looking. "Everywhere," he said at last. "Everywhere that it is." That night she did not sleep. She lay in the loft, and she was honest with herself because that was the only way she knew how to lie in the dark, and she admitted that she had been wrong about the drawer. The things she had put in the drawer and carefully labeled and set aside with the full intention of leaving it there had not stayed in the drawer. It had grown in the drawer as living things do in warm and ordinary conditions until the drawer could no longer hold it, and now it was simply present in the room with everything else. She loved him, not with the desperate, consuming love of a woman who needs to be loved in return in order to exist. She was not built for that kind. She had seen that kind, and she had understood, from watching others, that was less love and more starvation, dressed in love's clothing. This was the other kind, the kind that had a foundation, the kind that had been built slowly from the ground up, observation by observation, morning by morning, moment by genuine moment, until it had become a thing solid enough to stand on. She loved him, and in 5 days he would ride away. She thought about this very clearly and without self-deception. He was a man from somewhere she did not know, going somewhere she did not know, carrying something heavy in the early mornings that he managed carefully in company, and he had a ring and a tin on her shelf that was not the ring of a common traveler, and he had a voice and a manner and a quality of listening that had not been assembled by an ordinary life. And she was a physician's daughter in a stone cottage in Derbyshire with books on every surface and a cat, and a garden, and a life that was entirely sufficient and entirely here. These were the facts. She arranged them in her mind the way she arranged a difficult case, without sentimentality, without the imposition of a preferred conclusion. These were the facts. She could not argue with facts. She could only decide what she was going to do with them. What she was going to do, she decided, lying in the dark with the sound of his breathing just audible through the low ceiling, was nothing. She was going to do nothing, because there was nothing to do. She was going to continue to be exactly what she was, because that was what she had always done, and it had never yet been the wrong choice. And when he left, she was going to watch him go with the same clear eyes she had watched everything else in her life. And afterward, she was going to continue. Because continuing was what she had. And continuing, she had always believed, was enough. She believed this firmly and completely. She did not sleep until nearly dawn. On the 14th day, something changed in the air between them. She could not have said precisely what changed or precisely when. It was not a single moment, but a series of moments, each one slightly charged in a way none of the preceding days had been, as if they had been walking toward something without knowing the direction and had suddenly, together and without coordination, understood where they were. She was aware of him differently. Not more, not with greater intensity. The intensity had been building for 2 weeks and was not a new thing. But differently, with a quality of attention that she did not entirely trust herself with. He had been helping her sort the herbs she had brought in from the garden, a task she had not asked him to help with, but which he had apparently observed being necessary, and had simply begun to assist with, because she had come to understand, a man who noticed what needed doing and did it without requiring the need to be formally identified. She had shown him which bundles went where, and he had worked with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and they had worked in silence for a time that was comfortable in the way only very familiar silences are comfortable. And then she had looked up from the bundle she was tying and found him watching her. Not with the measuring look, not with the careful, layered look. He was simply looking at her with something that was not hidden and was not managed and was entirely visible to anyone with eyes for it. And Clara had eyes for it, had always had eyes for things, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched itself. "Clara," he said, very quietly, her name only, but with a quality in the saying of it that she had not heard before, a quality of arriving at something after a long distance, a quality of intention that was past the point of managing. She said, "Don't." She said it gently, without anger, without anything except the honesty that she could not help. Not unless you intend to finish what you start. Not unless it is real. He was quiet for a long moment. She went back to the bundle she was tying. Her hands were perfectly steady, which surprised her because the rest of her was considerably less than perfectly steady. "What if it is real?" he said, and his voice was very careful around the question, with the care of a man who has not asked a real question in a very long time and has not forgotten how frightening it is. Clara set down the bundle. She looked at him across the table, across the herbs she had grown and harvested and brought in from the garden, across the ordinary working surface of her ordinary working life. And she said the truest thing she knew. "Then I would need to know who you are. Not the name you gave me. Who you are." Silence. The cat shifted on the windowsill. The fire moved. James Ashford, Duke of Ravensdale, looked at Clara Wren across her kitchen table and felt, for the first time in 7 years, the specific terror of being genuinely in the position of having something to lose. He had managed the feeling for 14 days. He had organized it and reasoned with it and placed it inside the careful structure he had built around himself over 7 years of being a title rather than a person. And it had grown there the way it had grown in her, in the warmth and the ordinariness of days, until the structure could no longer contain it. He understood, looking at her now, that there was no management available for what he was feeling, because what he was feeling had the particular quality of truth, which is that it does not respond to management. It can only be told or not told. He began to speak. He told her about the title first, because the title was the thing that changed everything and she deserved to have it first so she could arrange the rest of the information around it. He watched her face when he said it. She went very still, the way she went still when something required her full attention, and she listened without interrupting. He told her about his father's death and the estate and the obligation that had come with the title at 23, when he had still been a person who believed that the world beyond the title was accessible, who had believed that the right woman would see the man and not the position. He told her about the engagement, not in detail, but in outline, enough that she could understand what it had taught him. That a woman could be genuinely warm, genuinely charming, genuinely persuasive, and be motivated by nothing more complicated than the desire for a particular kind of life, and that the man inside the title could be entirely invisible to her, while the title itself remained entirely visible. He told her that he had ridden away from London 3 weeks ago because the engagement he was now in, an arrangement his mother considered appropriate and his advisors considered strategic, and everyone in his world considered the obvious conclusion to years of remaining unwed, had finally produced in him a feeling he could not continue to ignore, the feeling of a door closing on someone who had never really been inside the room to begin with. He told her about the horse and the storm and the fall. He did not dress any of it in anything other than what it was. When he finished, the cottage was very quiet. Clara had not moved. She was looking at him with those brown eyes that saw things honestly and reported honestly on what they saw, and he waited because he had done the telling and the receiving was hers. She said, "The ring in the tin." "Yes. You knew I had not looked at it." "I thought you had not." "I was not certain." Clara looked at the tin on the shelf. She looked back at him. Something was moving through her face, not a single thing, several things, the way weather moves across open country, one front following another, each one different. He watched it move and did not try to intercept it. "You let me not know," she said at last. "For 14 days. Yes, because here you were not a duke. Because here," James said very quietly, "I was someone whose name you did not know and whose company you valued anyway." "Yes." She was quiet again. He let the quiet be what it was. "That was not entirely fair," Clara said finally, and her voice was even, but the evenness was working. "To me." "No," he said. "It was not." She nodded once, the small decisive nod he had come to recognize as the one she gave when she was acknowledging a fact she would have preferred not to be a fact. She stood. She moved to the shelf. She took the tin down, opened it, and took out the ring. She looked at the crest, looked at it properly for the first time. Then she set on the table in front of him. "You should have this," she said. "Clara, you should have it," she said again, and her voice had the quality of a door being held open from the inside, held with effort, not slammed, but held, because slamming required feeling that she was not willing to give to the moment without thinking first. "And I think you should tell me what you intend. Plainly, without management." He picked up the ring. He did not put it on. He held it in his hand, and he looked at her, and he said, plainly, without management, "I intend to return to London. I have obligations I cannot continue to abandon, and a situation that requires my direct presence. There are things I should have faced rather than ridden away from." He paused, "And then I intend to come back." The cottage held this sentence for a moment. "You intend," Clara said carefully, "to come back." "I intend to come back," James said, "if you will let me." She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. He had learned, in 14 days, that Clara Wren did not respect anything that could not hold her gaze when the looking was serious. And this was the most serious looking she had done, which meant it required his best stillness and his most honest face. "Go and do what you need to do," she said at last, "and we will see." It was not a yes. It was not a no. It was the most honest answer available to a woman who valued honesty above all other things and who knew, because she was who she was, that she could not promise what she did not know and could not know what she did not know yet. And what she did not know yet was whether he was a man who meant what he said or a man who said what he needed to say to get what he wanted in the moment and believed it genuinely while he was saying it and discovered afterward that the distance between a London life and a Derbyshire cottage was not a distance that sentiment survived. She had seen that happen. She was too honest not to name the possibility. He left on the 16th morning. She woke to the sound of him in the stable she kept behind the cottage, which she had not heard him use before, and she understood, when she heard it, that he had found where she kept the neighbor's old horse that she occasionally borrowed for errands, and that he had prepared his own animal in the night, probably unable to sleep, probably choosing the early departure the way people choose things that have to happen and are better over with before thinking gets involved. She came down from the loft. She put her feet in her boots, and she went outside. He was mounted. The morning was very early, the sky that particular shade between dark and light that the day uses when it is not yet committed to being a day. He was wearing the coat she had cleaned and mended, which she had not mentioned and he had not mentioned, because it was simply a thing that needed doing and she had done it. He looked, in the pale, early light, both like the man she had come to know and like a stranger, which was perhaps what he was, which was perhaps the most honest version of what he was. He looked down at her from the horse for a moment without speaking. His face was very clear in the gray light. She had learned his face well enough in 16 days to read the layers of it, and what she read now was not easy to hold. The weight of something that he was choosing to carry away from this place rather than speak aloud, perhaps because speaking it would require her to answer, and he did not want to put the weight of an answer on her before she was ready. She understood this about him. She was not sure she had ever understood someone this specifically, this quickly. "Thank you," he said, very simply, the words carrying everything the other words had not been said. "Ride carefully," she said. "The shoulder will tell you when you've done enough." Something crossed his face. He nodded, once, and then he turned the horse and rode, the sound of hooves on the wet path fading with the same deliberate patience with which the morning light was growing, and Clara stood in the doorway of her cottage and watched him go until the road bent and the trees took him and there was nothing left to watch. She went inside. She made tea. She sat down at the table where the herbs were still laid out from 2 days ago, and she held the cup in both hands, and she let herself feel it fully, because she had promised herself she would, because suppression was not what her father had taught her. She let herself feel the size of it, the specific shape of the absence in the cottage that had been filled for 16 days and was now unfilled, the quality of the silence that had changed, again, from the manageable silence of a woman alone to the other kind, the kind with a particular person's absence in it, the kind that was shaped like someone. She sat with it until the tea was cold, and then she rose and went to the garden, because the garden was there and needed her and would not wait for grief to finish its business. And this was something she had always found, oddly, to be not the cruelty of ordinary life, but its particular mercy. That the world continued, that it required your hands, That continuing was not betrayal, but a kind of faithfulness to the living fact of existing, which demanded always that you show up to it. She was in the garden, on her knees in the dirt with the late morning sun on her back, when she heard the sound of a horse on the road. Not his horse. She knew the sound of his horse now. This was different, heavier, and accompanied by a second set of hooves. She looked up. Two men on horseback, well-dressed, the kind of well-dressed that meant London and meant business, were speaking to old Mr. Parkin at the corner of the lane. She could not hear what they were saying. She could see Parkin's face, which was turned toward her cottage with the particular expression of a man who has just been asked something he knows the answer to. One of the riders looked in the direction of her gate. Clara stood. She brushed the dirt from her knees. She watched them come up the lane with the quiet, measuring attention she brought to everything unfamiliar. The nearer man removed his hat. He had the look of a secretary or a steward, someone whose job was to manage the gap between a person of great importance and the world that person needed to move through. He said, with practiced courtesy, "I beg your pardon, ma'am. We are searching for a gentleman, the Duke of Ravensdale. We were informed his horse was seen on this road 3 weeks past." Clara looked at the man. The Duke of Ravensdale. The title landed in the ordinary morning air of Thornmere Lane and sat there, very large, very specific, rearranging the light around itself the way a stone rearranges water when it is dropped into a still pool. The Duke of Ravensdale. Not a traveler, she had known that. Not a man of ordinary circumstances, she had known that too. But she had held the knowing at a careful distance, had allowed herself to understand enough to be honest and no further, because further had felt like a door she was not entitled to open. Now the door was open from the outside, and she was standing in front of it, and the distance between a physician's daughter in Thornmere and a Duke of Ravensdale was not a distance she had allowed herself to fully calculate until this precise moment, because she had not let herself need to, and now she needed to, and the calculation was very clear and very quiet and very large. She thought of the morning at the window, the weight he had been carrying, quiet and alone, in the first light. She thought of what he had said, "I intend to come back, if you will let me." She thought, for the first time and fully, about what it would mean to let him, what she would be walking into, what would be required of a woman who walked into that life, into those rooms that rearranged themselves, into that managed and public and enormous life, a woman who had never performed anything, whose entire way of existing in the world depended on the freedom to simply be what she was without apology or adjustment. And she thought about what it would mean to not let him, what she would be left with, whether she was the kind of woman who could choose the clean, sufficient life and mean it fully, and not spend the rest of it in the knowledge of what she had set down. The secretary was waiting with patient courtesy for her answer. Clara looked at him. She said, simply, "He was here. He is gone. He was well when he left." She paused, and then, because she was what she was and could not be otherwise, she added one more honest thing. "Tell whoever is looking for him that he rode carefully." She turned and went back into the cottage. She sat in the chair by the fire and looked at the table where the herbs were laid out and the shelf where the tins sat empty and the window where the morning had gone fully to light. And she felt the thing she had not let herself feel while he was here, not the love. She had felt that clearly and without evasion, but the fear. The specific and reasonable fear of a woman who knows her own worth and also knows, with equal clarity, exactly how much the world believes her worth is worth. The question was not whether he meant what he had said. She believed, with the same instinctive certainty with which she read a wound, that he meant it. The question was whether meaning it was enough, whether the life attached to a Duke of Ravensdale had room in it for a woman who would not reduce herself to fit, whether the world he moved in, the world of managed rooms and adjusted spaces and performance on every surface, had any tolerance at all for someone who had not learned how to perform trustworthiness, because she had never needed to, because the trust was simply what was there when all the performance was removed. She did not know the answer. She sat with the not knowing the way she sat with difficult cases. Honestly, without forcing a conclusion, prepared to wait for the evidence. Outside, Thornmere went on with its morning. A cart rolled past on the lane. A dog barked somewhere near the common. The sun found its full height and sent a strip of warm light across the floor of the cottage, crossing the board slowly as time moved, as it always moved, as it had no interest in stopping simply because one woman sitting in one chair needed a moment longer to understand what was happening to her life. She sat in the chair, and she was still, and the cottage held her silence, as it had always held her silence, patiently and without judgment, waiting with the particular waiting of a place that has known a person long enough to know that they will find their way, given time, given honesty, given the courage to remain in the difficulty without flinching until the difficulty becomes something navigable. She would find her way. She sat, and she was still, and she let the morning move around her, and she began, very quietly, to think. 3 weeks after he rode away, a letter arrived. Not a grand letter. Not the kind of letter that announces itself before you have finished breaking the seal. All declaration and urgency and the breathless architecture of feeling badly contained. It was a quiet letter. 3 pages in a hand that was exact and unhurried. The hand of someone who had taken time with the writing because the writing mattered, and who had not dressed that matching up in performance. Because performance was not something this particular writer had ever found useful for things that were real. He wrote about the botanical illustrations first. He had found, in his father's library, the Forster edition that he had mentioned, and had spent an evening with both volumes open on the desk, comparing the rendering of the root systems with the attention of a man who had been given a reason to care about root systems again. He wrote that she had been right about the Forster, that the artist's technique was superior in the detail of the smaller specimens, but that hers had the better quality of honesty in the larger plates, the willingness to render difficulty as difficulty rather than smoothing it into elegance. He wrote that he had told his mother something that had produced a silence lasting the better part of 2 days, which he was beginning to consider one of the more successful conversations of his adult life. He did not say what he had told her. He wrote that his shoulder was behaving as she had predicted, which was to say it was telling him when he had done enough, and he was, for the first time in his memory, listening to what it said. At the very end, without preamble, he wrote, "I am asking nothing of you. I'm only telling you that the cottage exists clearly in my mind in a way that nothing has existed clearly for several years. I'm telling you this because you asked me to be plain, and I find I no longer know how to be anything else." Clara read the letter 3 times. She sat on the table beside the botanical illustrations, where it stayed for 2 days, and she went on with her work. Thornmere had been talking. She had understood this would happen from a moment the secretary had asked his question in the lane, and she had made her peace with it in the same quiet and thorough way she made her peace with most things, which was to acknowledge it fully and then decide it was not going to determine what she did. The talk had the usual quality of village talk, a mixture of the genuinely curious and the insufficiently occupied, and it covered the usual range. Some of it was warm, the warmth of people who liked Clara Wren and were pleased that something interesting had happened to her, even if they were not certain what. Some of it was the other kind, Mrs. Alden from the upper end of the village, who had always possessed both strong opinions and a very limited appetite for examining them, stopped Clara on the path one morning and delivered herself of a speech about the inadvisability of young women forming connections above their station, and the particular foolishness of women who allowed hope to do the work that common sense should be doing, and the way that men of rank and position had a long and consistent history of charming women of lower circumstance for reasons that had nothing to do with honorable intention. She delivered this speech with the air of one performing a public service, her chin positioned at the altitude of the morally certain. Clara listened with the full attention she gave to everything. Then she said, calmly and without particular heat, "Mrs. Alden, I'm the daughter of the man who attended your family for 30 years without once mentioning what he knew about them. I have the same professional discretion he had, and I exercise it in all directions, including this one." She paused just briefly. "Good morning." She walked home and sat in the chair by the fire with the letter and the botanical illustrations and the cat, and she thought with the specific concentration she brought to difficult cases. She thought about the distance between Thornmere and London, which was not only the literal distance, though that was real, She thought about what it meant to enter a life in which rooms adjusted themselves, in which every surface was a performance, in which the woman attached to the Duke of Ravensdale would be looked at and assessed and found either sufficient or deficient according to measurements she had never learned because they had never applied to her. She thought about whether she could survive that, and she was honest enough to acknowledge that survival was not the question. She had survived things. The question was whether she could remain herself inside it, whether the cottage, as he had put it, could exist inside her even when she was standing in the kind of room that had no place for it. She thought about his face at the window at first light, the weight he was carrying alone, the specific quality of a person who has been managing something very heavy for a very long time without anyone to set it down with. She thought about what her father had said once, about the difference between a sufficient life and a chosen one. A sufficient life, he had said, was not nothing. It was in fact a great deal. But a chosen life was something else. It was the life you built when you knew what you wanted and you decided that wanting it was worth the risk of trying to have it. He had meant it about medicine, about his choice to practice rather than simply study, but she had always understood that he meant it about everything, that he was telling her something general and true about what it meant to be alive with intention. She took out paper. She wrote back. She wrote plainly. She told him what Mrs. Alden had said, not to produce sympathy, but because it was part of the honest picture. She told him that she had been thinking about what it would mean to enter his world, and that the thinking had produced both clarity and difficulty, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise. She told him that she could not promise to be a good duchess in the way the world had a definition for one. She could not promise to diminish or to manage or to perform. She could only be exactly what she was, entirely, which was a great deal and also something that had never in her experience been universally welcomed. She told him that if the life attached to his title had no room for someone who took up exactly the space she took up without apology, she needed to know, because she could not find out afterward without it costing her something she could not afford. She ended with this: I am not afraid of difficulty. I have never been. I'm only careful about what I choose to be difficult for. So I'm asking you plainly, as you asked me to ask, is there room in the life you have for someone who will not be smaller than she is? She sent it. She went back to the garden. She did not have to wait as long as she had expected. She was on her knees in the dirt 11 days later when she heard the sound of a horse on the lane. Not the secretary's horse. She knew that sound. She knew this sound. She had known it for 16 days and had been carrying the knowledge of it somewhere in the back of her chest ever since. The way you carry something you have not let yourself look at directly. She looked up. She looked at the lane. He dismounted at the gate with the care of a man whose shoulder was still telling him things. And he opened the gate and walked up the path through the garden toward where she was kneeling in the dirt, and he was not wearing the fine coat. He was wearing the repaired one, the one she had cleaned and mended. He had come back in the coat she had put her hands on. She did not know why this particular detail arrived in her chest with such force, but it did. She got her feet. She did not brush her hands on her apron first. She simply stood, with the garden around her and the dirt on her knees, and the morning sun arriving at an angle that suited no one's idea of a romantic scene and suited her life exactly. And she looked at him as he came up the path and stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, the way he had looked at the botanical illustrations, without agenda, simply looking at the thing as it was. Then he said, yes. Just that. One word. Her question answered. Yes, he said again, more quietly. There is room. There will be room. Not because I have constructed it, not because I have managed it in advance, but because the life that has me in it will have you in it as well. And you take up exactly the space you take up, and any room that cannot hold that is not a room I intend to continue to live in. He stopped. He was very still in the way she had come to love about him, the structural stillness, the stillness of someone built that way. I ended the engagement 2 weeks after I returned. I told my mother, which produced the silence I mentioned in the letter. I have been in the process of understanding what I am willing to do and what I am not willing to do, which is a process I should have begun several years ago and did not, because I had convinced myself that what the world expected of me and what I wanted for my life were close enough to the same thing that the distance between them was not worth the trouble of crossing. He paused. "You are worth the trouble," he said. "Not because you need rescuing, not because you are without your own sufficient life, but because I have looked at a great many rooms in 7 years, and this garden is the only thing I have stood in that did not require me to be different from what I am, and I find I'm not willing to ride away from that again." Clara looked at him. She felt the fullness of it, the whole weight of the 16 days and the letter and the 11 days of waiting and the question she had sent and the one word he had come back with, and she let herself feel it completely, as her father had taught her, without management, without reduction. She said, "I will not become someone else for you." "I know," he said. "I will be difficult on a regular basis. I will disagree with you. I will have opinions about things, and I will not soften them for the sake of the room." "I know," he said again, and the corner of his mouth moved. "I will keep the cottage." "Yes," he said. "Obviously." She looked at him. The morning moved around them both. The cat had appeared at the garden gate and was surveying the situation with the sovereign indifference of a creature who has seen a great deal of human behavior and revised its expectations accordingly downward. She reached out and took his hand. Not the one with the ring, the other one, the one whose palm she had cleaned and bandaged on the first night, which had healed entirely and was now simply his hand, warm and real in hers. "Then yes," she said, and her voice was steady, because she was, and because this was not the desperate yes of a woman who has been waiting to be chosen. It was the considered yes of a woman who has done the thinking and looked at the facts and decided, clearly and with full knowledge of what she was deciding, that this was what she wanted and she was not going to be too careful to want it. He closed his hand around hers. The morning held them both. The world took its time understanding what had happened, which was characteristic of the world. The announcement produced, in London, the expected range of responses. Surprise, because no one had known where the Duke of Ravensdale had been for 3 weeks, and some of them were not certain they had heard the name of the county correctly, let alone the village. Interest of the sharp, assessing variety that London brought to everything that disrupted an established arrangement. Curiosity about the woman herself, who was not what anyone had imagined and not what anyone would have predicted, which produced a particular kind of attention that Clara walked into with her eyes open and her chin at the altitude of someone who has never learned to lower it. The first London event she attended, as is intended, was a musical evening, because it seemed to her that a musical evening was a less aggressive introduction than a ball, and because she had asked for this and James had agreed with the small, particular expression he wore when she proposed something practical that he should have thought of himself. She wore a gown that was good without being elaborate, because elaborate had never suited her, and she was not going to start now. She wore her hair simply. She walked into the room on his arm with the same quality she brought to the cottage and the garden and the lane in Thornmere, which was the quality of someone who has not learned how to perform presence, because their presence does not require performance to be real. The room did not know what to make of her, which she had anticipated. She did not make it easy for the room to decide, which was not strategy, but simply who she was. She spoke when she had something to say. She listened when she did not. She was warm to the people who were warm, and she was civil to the people who were not, which was all she had ever been and was apparently sufficient, because the room, over the course of an evening, stopped performing quite so hard around her and began, tentatively and in the way of things that are not used to being asked to be genuine, to simply be what it was. James watched this happen from across the room with an expression she had not seen on him before. She caught it once, just briefly, when she glanced in his direction mid-conversation. He was not watching her with the managed watchfulness she had seen in the early days. He was watching her with something open in his face, something she recognized because she had seen it in her father's face across rooms. The expression of a person looking at someone who is exactly where they belong and knowing it with the full weight of gratitude. She went home thinking about root systems, the way they built themselves in the dark below the visible surface without announcement, the way you could not see them working, the way you could only see the evidence of what they had done when the plan above stood in whatever weather came and held. Mrs. Alden heard the news with the particular expression of someone who has committed a position publicly and is now required to manage it privately. She made no further speeches. Clara did not require an apology, and none was given, and that was the end of it in precisely the way Clara thought it should end, which was quietly and without ceremony. The village found, over time, that what it had always valued about Clara Wren had not changed. What had changed was only the room she walked into when the work was done, and the person who was there when she returned, and the hand she reached for in the morning. These were additions, not replacements. Thornmere came to understand this gradually and in the unself-conscious way of a community that had known a woman for 26 years and simply updated its understanding to account for the new information, which was what good communities did. She did not leave the cottage. She had told him she would not, and he had known she meant it. They divided their time as the obligations of his title required and as her own work required, and the two requirements were negotiated with the same honest plainness that she brought to every other difficult question, and the negotiating was sometimes hard and always worth doing. The cottage had a second chair now, and the second chair was occupied in a way that suited it, and the cat had transferred its allegiance to the lap that was most convenient on any given evening with the impartial logic of a creature who considers all arrangements provisional and subject to revision. On a morning late in the autumn, when Amor had gone to that particular goal that comes just before the color gives up entirely and returns the landscape to its winter grays, Clara sat her chair by the fire with a book open in her lap, and the fire burning low and the candle lit against the early dark. Not because she could not sleep. She slept very well now, but because she loved the early dark of autumn, the quality of the light at that hour, the specific comfort of a room that held someone who would be back presently, having gone to check on the horse before the temperature dropped. She heard the door. She heard the familiar, particular sound of him, the careful closing, the specific quality of his movement through a space he had come to know as well as she knew it. She did not look up from the page. She did not need to. He came and sat in the other chair. He picked up the volume he had left on the table the evening before, the natural history she had lent him, the one her father had annotated, and he opened it to where he had left a marker, and he read, and the fire moved between them, and the moor lay quiet outside the window, and the cottage held them both the way it had always held her, patiently and without judgment, with the particular warmth of a place that has known what it is for and has found it. The night she had first seen him, Clara Wren had not been asleep. She had been sitting in this chair, in this light, reading about birds that navigated by stars and magnetic fields, and something else that the scientists had not yet found a name for, something internal and sure, and the knock had come, and she had opened the door. Now, on the nights when the rain came and the fire burned low and the books lay open on every surface, Clara Wren was not alone. And the something that had no name, the internal and sure thing, had found its direction at last, and it had not required the world's permission to do so, and it had not required her to be less than everything she was, and it was by every honest measure she had ever applied to anything, exactly enough. More than enough. Real. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.